Yo, coming to you live from the beautiful Melbourne, Australia. And this is our first rendition of the Young Adult Bible Study and Bible Guide. I get it that the Bible can be long and intimidating, but it doesn't have to be. So what we're going to be doing is going through each and every book step by step and taking the biggest takeaways from a young adult's perspective on what we can use in our every single day lives. So we're going to be jumping in to the first book of the Bible, the action-packed Genesis. Let's get after it. So a little update. Unfortunately, due to coronavirus, obviously travel has kind of stopped for a little bit, and I wasn't able to get these guides done in the other countries that you saw, like in the intro video just a second ago. So for now, you're getting me from my beautiful, as you can see by the reflection on the door behind me, beautiful Playa del Carmen, Mexico, until I can start traveling again. We can start kind of traveling together again and preaching the good news around the world. So without further ado, let's dive into book number one, stop number one on our young adult Bible guide, Genesis. So first, I think we need a little bit of background information on the story of Genesis. So I'll give you a very, very brief 1-2 minute overview for you. And Genesis is absolutely action-packed. So it all starts with Adam and Eve in the garden, and this is when sin entered the world, when they ate the forbidden fruit and got kicked out of the Garden of Eden. From there, humans began multiplying rapidly and actually became way too evil, and God was super upset with them. So he decided to rid the earth of them all with a giant flood, except Noah and his family, and obviously two of each, every single animal in the ark. So hundreds of years go by, and Abraham comes up. And Abraham, by relentlessly following the Lord, actually created a covenant with him that him and his inheritance and his family would end up inheriting the best land on earth, the promised land, the land of Canaan. And he ended up having a son named Isaac, and Isaac had two sons named Jacob and Esau. Esau was the firstborn and actually ended up giving up his firstborn birthright to Jacob. So Jacob ended up actually inheriting all of Israel, inheriting the covenant with God and the promised land with that. Jacob, who ended up changing his name to Israel, ended up having 12 sons, one of them most notably named Joseph. So the good old story of the Joseph and the dream code happens, and he ends up saving all of his brothers and his entire family and the entire nation of Israel by bringing them into Egypt with him. Now, obviously, that's a way too brief 1-2 minute overview of the stories of Genesis and how action-packed this book is. And we've all heard a ton of these stories, especially a lot of these are our childhood stories that you would see in Christian children's books. So before we dive in to the biggest takeaways for us young adult Christians in the 21st century from Genesis today, I'd like to hear your favorite story or your biggest takeaway from the book of Genesis. It could be, the little Bible stories of Noah's Ark and kind of the crazy faith he had, the crazy faith Abraham had or Joseph had. Any one of those stories, just comment it down below. I'd love to hear from you. And next, let's dive into the biggest takeaway number one from Genesis for us young adult Christians. So, as mentioned, there are a ton of great stories in this book of the Bible and absolutely action-packed, as you know. But I wanted to pick out a few details and a few thought-provoking parts that maybe you actually haven't heard of before, thought about, or maybe even read in the Bible that directly relate to our lives as young adult Christians. And actually, both of them pertain to Joseph and the back end of his story. Him being a young adult, throughout the majority of his story in the Bible, I feel could really teach us a few things, how we should carry ourselves and believe and trust in the Lord as we go through our everyday lives. So, biggest takeaway number one is when you let God work through you, you are in turn capable of all things. So first, a little more backstory and a little more detail on the story of Joseph so we can understand it a little bit better and understand these lessons a little bit more full. So Joseph, as mentioned, was one of Jacob/Israel's 12 sons and his absolute favorite. Joseph ended up having a dream that all of his brothers and his entire family would end up bowing down to him at one point. And because of this, logically, the older brothers got a little salty, got a little angry, and decided to sell him off into slavery and tell his father he got killed by a lion. The classic older brother kind of stuff. So Joseph was sold into slavery, ended up in Egypt, and ended up in a jail cell there for years and years. And in that jail cell, he actually ended up helping a few other prisoners interpret their dreams, as that was his God-given talent based off of his dream about his brothers bowing down to him. So word actually got up to the Pharaoh at the time, and when he couldn't interpret a dream, they brought Joseph up to help him do it. And that's where this part kind of starts for us, is Joseph was brought up to Pharaoh, and when Pharaoh asks if Joseph can interpret his dream, Joseph responds in a very particular way that I think could help a lot of us out in our everyday lives. So in Genesis 41:16, it says, "I cannot do it," Joseph replied to Pharaoh, "but God will give Pharaoh the answer he deserves." And boom, there it is. Joseph doesn't glorify himself and take pride in his ability to interpret the dreams, but specifically says, "I can't do it. I can't interpret your dreams, Pharaoh, but God can. God, the one and only, the one who can work through me to interpret your dreams, can do it." He gives the glory up to God. Then in turn, for his faith and humility, God gives the glory back to Joseph. As the story goes on, as you may know, Joseph becomes Pharaoh's right-hand man and actually in charge of all of Egypt and has all the wealth that he could ever imagine in his life. So it goes to show, when you refrain your pride and just a simple switch of your wording and simple switch of your thought process of it's God's ability and he's just working through me, you become capable of all things. So whenever you're faced with a struggle or challenge in our everyday life, such as applying for a college, applying for a job, asking a girl out on a date, or winning over that new client that you desperately need to pay your bills, you can then refrain your question from, can I do this? Do I have the ability to do this? To, can God do this? Does God have the ability to make this happen? And when you can say that, when you can refrain your question and switch it from can I do this to can God do this, you are then able to answer that question every single time, because God is capable of all things. The one and only is capable of all things. So it will always be a yes. So not only will God bless you for giving the glory up to him, but in turn allows him to work through you and makes you capable of all things far outside of your own ability, your own comprehension, your own dreams, and your own thoughts. When God's able to work through you, you become capable of all things. You just have to allow him to do that. And now moving on to our big takeaway, number 2. Numero dos, as they say down in Mexico. Everything happens according to God's plan and not your own plan. Just like the coronavirus, everything happens for a reason. Everything's happening according, not to our plan, because obviously coronavirus wasn't our plan. It wasn't our plan to be stuck in our houses and possibly losing our jobs or not graduating college because of this, but according to God's plan. And he has a plan for this. He has this happening for a reason. But yet again, let's jump back in to Joseph's life. Joseph's life. So, after he became second in command of Pharaoh, kind of where we left off before, the world went into a huge famine. But because God was with Joseph, he devised a plan to store up a bunch of grain for the future to prepare him and the Egyptians for this famine. So while other countries were dying in desperate need of food and water, Egypt was actually thriving. So long story short, his brothers that sold him into slavery ended up coming to Egypt to beg for help. So after messing with him for a little bit, as naturally you do after your older brothers just sold you off into slavery, Joseph finally reveals himself to his brothers and decides to help them by giving them everything they need and giving them a home in Egypt, basically saving their lives and basically saving Israel and his entire family life. Now, obviously, Joseph could have had his way with his brothers just like they did with him. I mean, like I said, I'd be pretty salty if this happened to me. I probably would start thinking more about revenge. But Joseph reacts in a completely another way that really shows us how we should live our lives as young adult Christians. So when he finally reveals himself to his brothers logically think that he wants revenge and wants to get back with him. But Joseph says this to them in Genesis verse 50, 19, and 20, or Genesis chapter 50, verse 19 and 20. But Joseph said to them, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended for good to accomplish what is now being done and saving many lives. So Joseph taking them in and helping them shows how enlightened he has become now that God is working absolutely through him and walking next to him every single day. It shows the unending love and kindness to turn the other cheek that us as Christians should have. Just think about how many times in our daily lives that we've cussed someone out or gotten angry and wanted to get revenge to another driver or a different sports fan or a coworker that has wronged you throughout the day. Instead of turning the other cheek, we always look for revenge. But it also shows that Joseph understood that everything happens for a reason. And it's God's reason, not his own reason. It wasn't his plan to be sold off into slavery. It was God's plan. Because if it wasn't for his brothers wronging him and selling him into slavery, he would never have become second in command to Pharaoh in Egypt. He would never have been able to save his lives and save all of Israel so then they could go on to the greatness that they're going to go on to have in these next couple chapters of the Bible. And he would never have been able to save his brothers, his family, his father, anything like that. He understood that the light only felt so good, the glory that he was getting only felt so good because of the darkness and the struggle that he went through. So when you're struggling or feel like you've been kicked down, just start to think, maybe it's for a specific reason to lift you back up. So yeah, you may have just gotten fired, especially with the huge unemployment that's happening with coronavirus right now. Well, maybe God didn't want you in that job anyways. Maybe there's another job that he has for you that will allow you to impact and save a bunch of lives, and you have to go through this unemployment period. Or maybe it's because he wants you at home with your children right now during their early stages of life, because you need to have a dramatic impact on your life and have been spending too much time in that job versus in your family on what really matters. So yeah, maybe you didn't get into that college that you applied for and really wanted to. Well, maybe that's because he knew you'd end up in the wrong crowd and leading the wrong kind of life if you went to that college. And actually, this next college that he has you set up to go to, the one that was maybe your second or third choice that you didn't really want to go in, but actually the woman of your dreams or your wife or your husband is sitting there waiting for you at that college because it's all in God's plan, not in your own plan. You have to understand that God's plan and God's final destination for your life, just like Joseph finally understood in retrospect, is greater than the one that you could ever imagine. He's got a plan, an all-knowing and powerful, amazing plan for your life, and you just have to be along for that ride. And those are the two biggest takeaways that I have from the book of Genesis, outside of kind of like the major stories and the stuff that we all know and have heard maybe a million times before. And if you haven't heard before, feel free to read Genesis yourself very quick. Would obviously absolutely love that. So up next is going to be our another action-packed chapter and our overview of Exodus coming up, where it goes into Moses leading the Israelites out of Egypt and ending up taking them towards, at least closer to, the promised land and the covenant that we mentioned with Abraham here. But I want us to really think about those two big takeaways from the end of Joseph's life and how we as young adults can really add those into our lives and impact other people and impact ourselves while we're at it. So big takeaway number one, when you let God work through you, you are in turn capable of all things. And big takeaway number two for Genesis, and especially the story of Joseph for us, is everything happens according to God's plan and not our own plan. Keep those two big takeaways in mind. Comment down below and let me know how this has impacted you and how you are going to add this in to your everyday life moving forward, or maybe a struggle that this is helping you kind of get through, knowing that you may be down for a reason and that it's God's reason to lift you up later on, that it's God's plan taking you to the next level. So thank you for joining us for this young adult guide to Genesis. Up next is Exodus, and I cannot wait for us to dive into that.